Hey, welcome to the second edition of 5-15-25. Tonight we'll hear from 3 designers share their stories and their experiences through different stages of their careers. So I'm going to jump straight into it and introduce the first speaker. So the first speaker is a design thinker, brand consultant, educator, wannabe writer, and has won numerous awards locally and overseas, but also this was all completed within probably 5 years of being graduating of his design education. So I'd like to introduce Henry Luong to come up.
Hello everyone. Can everyone hear me very well? So I'll just flip to the next slide. So my name's Henry. It's been about 6.5 years now since I left uni, I think. Janice tells me it's 7 actually, but I like to think it's more like 6. Even though it's only been 6 years, I feel like I've aged 20. So this was me years and years ago. Still got the same haircut today actually. Hasn't changed all these years. Don't have a scuba actually, but I thought the scuba might match my quarter-life crisis. So I never really thought I would end up as a designer. Initially, when I was in high school, I actually thought I would become a writer, but by circumstance I ended up as a designer and enjoyed it quite a bit. I was listening to Triple J just before actually I came, and they had a hack on and they were talking about all these rags to riches stories about people who come from poverty to famous riches. I haven't had one of those stories. I come from a very supportive family. I went to one of the more respected schools in WA, so I kind of was given every opportunity to do what I wanted to do. And I remember my dad used to always say he didn't really care what I pursued as a career. All that he wanted was for me to kind of do my best at it and kind of excel at it. So today I kind of wanted to frame my talk in terms of what I've done over the past 6 years. When I was asked to talk here today, I was kind of thinking about what I've kind of done over the past 6 years, and I didn't really take the time to reflect on what I've done, but it turns out conveniently I've done 5 things, which kind of matches the theme of tonight's evening. So I'll quickly run through what those are, and then we can kind of go through those in a little bit more detail. So I started off as a student. Then I kind of worked for a couple of years at a couple of different places. Then I ended up somehow starting my own business without any prior business knowledge. Somehow I ended up teaching as well. Never thought I'd do that, but here I am today still doing that. And then I am a business owner, so I left my first and second business, and now I'm in the process of starting a third business. So we'll start in terms of my student years, which I like to call the formative years. So as I said earlier, I kind of, in high school, I was kind of pushed towards to be a writer. It's kind of what I did really well at high school. And I remember my English teacher saying I should pursue that. So I did pursue that for about 1 year with these kind of aspirations to become some famous novelist. At the end of my first year in a writing degree, I kind of realised that I wasn't going to make it as a novelist or a poet or a short fiction writer for that matter. And somehow I ended up in design. And I'd like to say it was kind of out of some sort of amazing passion for design, but if I was to be completely honest, it was a decision kind of that was slightly practical at the time. So in the beginning, I was an absolutely terrible student, particularly in my first year of design. I remember I must have failed 1 or 2 units at least in that first year. It wasn't really until the second year of uni where I truly found my feet in the course. That was the year when I actually met a guy called Daniel, who's in the audience tonight. And one thing I took out of that was if we'd never met each other or our circle of friends at uni, I don't think I would be here standing today. I think by surrounding myself with these people who pushed us to do better and better work through those uni years is what kind of led me to where I am today. So I think it's important, particularly as a student, to surround yourself with people who are willing to go that extra mile to do things outside of uni to get further in life. Building strong habits. During that time as well, I kind of slowly but surely removed those terrible habits I had of procrastinating and not doing anything half the time. And I've kind of slowly but surely built strong habits, work ethic and so forth. One thing I think back on that I was particularly good at, because I never really thought of myself as a particularly talented designer, I guess. Where I thought I always excelled was I had a particularly good work ethic, and if I was ever going to do anything, I would do it with absolute conviction. And that's, I think, what led me to today rather than pure talent. So after the 3 years of uni, we finally was about to enter the real world. And lucky enough, when I was in my 3rd year of uni, I was able to find employment before I left. So I worked in an art gallery for about 9 months before I left uni, which was a pretty good learning curve before I left. But then I lost that particular job actually, and then we had to enter the real world. So this was like, it was 2009, so it was the height of the GFC. Everything was kind of bad in the economy and there didn't seem to be any jobs around. It's quite a negative period in time in terms of everything that was happening in the news. So during this period of time I worked at a couple of different places here in Perth, which I think was a period of discovery more than anything else. During that period of time I think I did have a bit of a confidence crisis. I didn't really know what I wanted out of my design education and what I was going to do. I was kind of at a bit of a loss. I certainly learned a lot during that period of time, but it certainly was a time where I think I was lacking in confidence. What was good, and sometimes I think I should have stayed longer working for other companies, is I picked up a lot of good and bad habits in terms of what I wanted to bring into my own business. And I think if I stayed longer working for other people, I probably would have picked up some better habits and learned some things that would have prevented some of the mistakes we made when we started our own business. So at the end of 2009, I think it was, I lost my job as a designer. I remember that was certainly a bit of a blow, and I remember speaking to Dan about it, and it was a very difficult time because it was during kind of a lot of economic unrest and all that sort of stuff. So I did kind of consider what I would do next at that point. So after that sort of short, I think it was about 2 or 3 weeks, Dan and I thought, the economy's terrible, everything's terrible, what else could go wrong? So let's just start our own business. So that's what we did. So we went down to St George's Terrace, we filled out all the relevant forms we needed to fill out, and we came up with a business name, and signed all the papers, and here we are, we started a business. And little did we know what that would entail over time, but that's what we chose to do, and I don't regret a second of it, I don't think, anyway. So I like to call this period of time kind of the unfiltered optimism phase of my career. I think this is the height of when we were the most optimistic. Over time, I think we became much more pragmatic and realistic about our prospects. But during this period of time, we went into business with zero business acumen. We knew nothing about cash flow and projection, about profit and loss, about setting up a business plan, about getting clients, about contracts we needed to sign with clients. We just kind of did everything by trial and error, really. So the reason why we kind of did it was because we talked about it for a long time. It was since uni, really. We talked about wanting to run our own business. Initially, during uni, we talked about running a t-shirt company or something along those lines, or some sort of album artwork design place. In the end, we decided, let's just do it. What else could go wrong? So if it fails, a design business at the end of the day is a very low-cost business to start. We just needed a couple of laptops, a room, and it was a pretty terrible room, but that's all we needed. A couple of laptops, our minds, and to find some clients, and away we could get. So Urban Studio at that time was born. This would have been beginning of 2010, I think. And we were just literally two guys in a tiny little room trying to find work to make a living, really. At the same time, at this point, I think, is when I got into teaching, which kind of helped a lot, and I think I learned a lot from that teaching experience as well in terms of how to run the business. So this was actually our first office we had. It was out the back of a printer in West Perth. Noise levels were through the roof all day. I remember there was a time when the lights turned off and they wouldn't turn back on, and we asked the landlord to fix it, but because we were so low on the priority list, he wouldn't come fix it. So we sat in the dark and we went to Bunnings and we bought one of those glow lamp things. And we ended up working practically in the dark for a couple of days. So those were interesting times. There was no windows in our office as well, so we kind of sat in this kind of terrible ambient light all day. One thing I learned from this time was we needed to buy better chairs, because I wanted to have a good back when I was 50, so we spent all my money on some nice chairs, and luckily to this day we have those chairs, so I'm very thankful that we spent all those thousands of dollars on nice chairs. One thing we were told when we initially started was that we should have complementary skill sets. The idea that we were basically versions of the same person, that we were both designers from the same background, wasn't going to work. We needed to have complementary skill sets. One of us needed to be a designer, one of us needed to be in account management, or one of us needed to be great at sales. But we were just same versions of, same person really. In the end, I think that's a good thing for us personally in the end, simply because by being very similar, we had to learn everything about business ourselves. So we didn't have anyone to rely on who could do the sales for us. We didn't have anyone to rely on who could do our business plan for us. We kind of had to just learn to do all that ourselves. And after all these years, I think we have kind of gained that knowledge by not knowing it at the beginning. And if we had a third business partner at the beginning who knew all that stuff, we probably wouldn't learn that stuff as quickly, I think. One thing that worked well in our favour, and I touched on this earlier, which is the kind of idea that I never really thought of myself as a particularly talented designer, is more that we had that kind of same level of discipline when we started. We were never the kind of guys who would think that we started a studio so we would play golf in the morning or have breakfast and come in at 10:30 in the morning. We were incredibly disciplined in the sense that 8:30 was our starting time for the office, and we'd come here, whether you lived 1 hour away or you needed to take 2 buses and a train, you come to work at 8:30. And I think that worked well for us in the end, in terms of we had this kind of discipline from the beginning to make the business work. So we came from a business mindset, I guess. One thing that I also look back on and think we could have done a lot better is this idea I call kind of decision paralysis, which is where when we started, I was always kind of very interested in kind of learning as much about business as I could, and I would read kind of all these articles about best practice in terms of writing a business plan, in terms of cash flow projections, in terms of how to produce sales. I read every journal, I read all these things from MBA students and graduates, from Harvard and so forth, and then in the end, weeks would pass and we wouldn't make a decision on a certain thing. And I think, looking in hindsight, we were very slow in making some of those decisions in setting up the business and gaining more work as we went over time. I think if we had kind of taken a more iterative approach to those decisions, that would have been a far better and fast-tracked us much better. During this time as well, I think we worked on some very interesting work. We were lucky enough to work with the likes of Curtin University whilst we were running Organ, and doing the RTR website certainly were highlights, I would say. We also made every mistake under the sun, I think, running business. It comes from us having the same skill sets again, so we didn't know what we were doing really. So we just kind of did it, and then if it didn't work, we didn't do it again, and then we did it again, then we wouldn't do it again. So it was kind of just a rinse and repeat sort of process of, if it didn't work, we wouldn't do it again. If it did work, we would just repeat that process again until it didn't work. And I think this is a good way of doing it. It certainly takes longer, and we made a lot of mistakes and lost money along the way by making some poor decisions. I remember by not kind of following our instincts on certain occasions, we kind of picked up clients that we really shouldn't have said yes to, and we did a lot of work and ended up in one particular case where we had to get lawyers involved, and a lot of letters were sent out, and this whole debacle came out. I think if we had followed our gut more, that wouldn't have happened. Whilst, I guess, I mean, at the time we were only, I think it was 22, so it was, we were certainly young, and I think we were very naive, inexperienced, and to this day I feel very naive and inexperienced. But I think my mentality on the whole process up until now has always been to make those mistakes and take those risks while I'm young. You know, when I'm older and I have much bigger mortgage repayments and I have 2 children, a swimming pool and 3 cars, I won't be able to make those same level of mistakes and take those same level of risk. So I feel like if I do everything I can now, live without regret, then when I do have all those things, then at least I know I tried it. Even if it failed, doesn't matter, because at least I tried it and it didn't work. So I remember in those early days we were absolutely terrible at sales, and we talked about it endlessly. The notion that we were decent designers, but we couldn't sell for the life of us. We went to see countless clients and trying to gain work, and all they saw were these kind of 18-year-old looking guys coming to see them, trying to get thousands of dollars from them for a design project. And we had to kind of fight tooth and nail for every single project because we had, you know, no portfolio, no projects under our belt as a business. We looked very young. We had an office at the back of a printer with no windows that didn't have lights. So it was kind of very difficult to, so a client would sometimes say, oh, can I come to your office for a meeting? And we would say, let's not do that. Shall we just meet in your office? That would probably be better. So those were the tough times, but over, I think, time we got slightly better at sales. Maybe not a whole lot better, but I think I'm slightly better at sales these days. I think in the end, after I think 2 or 3 years running Organ, what we started to get comfortable with is that level of uncertainty, not knowing what was going to happen next week or next month or even next year. We slowly but surely, I think, got more comfortable with that uncertainty that arose every single day. You know, some days we wouldn't know, what was going to happen on that very day. Some days we'd be designing, other days we would be speaking to lawyers about chasing money. So I think we slowly but surely got comfortable with being uncertain. And out of that, we met a marketing strategist and an account manager called Christine. This was about 3 years into running Organ Studio. And I remember we started doing a few freelance projects together, and Dan and I discussed the notion, we'd always discussed the notion of how we were going to build the business into something slightly larger and whether we needed to bring an additional partner on board to complete that holy trinity of skills. Because at the end of the day, even though we pretended we could do sales, we pretended we could do marketing strategy, it was better if we could find someone who could actually do those things. So after all that, we ended up forming a new company called LivingBrand with the hopes of establishing a more full-service agency. As Organ Studio, we kind of ran a much more, we were seeking clients from a kind of perspective of being a boutique design studio. So we had these big aspirations to run a company which was slightly larger, where we could offer much more complete services from brand strategy all the way to rolling out a brand and managing the brand as well. So we started LivingBrand roughly about 2 years ago now, and we got windows in our office, which was fantastic. We got a much nicer office as well. The light was better, the chairs were better, everything was better, everything seemed amazing and rosy at that period of time. So at that point, a duo became a trio, so we added an additional partner to the business, we formed this new business, and I think it's something that I definitely don't regret, becoming a trio rather than a duo. I think adding that additional partner helped immensely in terms of supplementing our lack of sales skills, and certainly from an account management point of view. During this time, we also got to work on a lot bigger projects. That was the goal as well, to establish ourselves as a larger company so that we could win larger clients. and work on more substantial work. So during that time, we got to work on rebranding Rottnest Island. We got to work with RTIFM, Curtin University. We got to work on one of the largest insurance brokers in Australia as well. So during that time, we kind of got a lot more large in terms of the scope of work we were able to achieve. One thing that we had to balance during that time as well was what I like to call passion versus practicality. As we grew bigger as a company, originally it was just the two of us, and we didn't mind eating ramen noodles every night. But when you have staff and you have to pay them, and you have an office and you have much larger overheads, suddenly it became a case where we had to consider whether we needed to take something out of pure practicality versus passion. So we kind of juggled this idea of balancing doing projects we love and projects that were going to be practical for the business as well. I remember hearing, I think it was a talk by Eric Spiegelman a couple of years ago where he spoke at Brand New, and he talked in his talk about the idea of he only ever shows work from his studio that is great work, but he referred to this idea of one of his clients was Bosch, and Bosch never gets revealed to his website or was shown as a case study, but Bosch was his biggest client, he said. And he said Bosch has tens of thousands of different types of drill bits, and it was his studio's job to brand and package each one of these drill bits. And he said someone in the studio always has to be doing that task, and it's what keeps the hot water on in his office in Berlin. And I thought it was an interesting point he made in terms of that idea of if you have a larger team, you have to consider that notion of passion versus practicality. So after that, it was about 2 years we ran LivingBrand. I remember when we first started LivingBrand, we had a meeting at, I think it was the lawyer's office, where we were debating about the structure of the new business, and then we were also discussing about exit strategy from the business. And from that time, we had initiated the idea of starting LivingBrand. I'd always said to the guys that I never thought I would be running LivingBrand for a particularly long time. The ongoing joke that we had was that I wanted to set up a balustrade business, which isn't true. I like balustrades, but I didn't want to set up a balustrade business. But the balustrade was a metaphor for me wanting to set up something that I could scale much faster. I think I always had this idea that I never really wanted to run a service-based business forever. I wanted to run or build a product of some sort that I could scale at a much faster pace. So after 2 years of running LivingBrand, I decided, whilst I'm still young, it's now or never to go and do that. So I thought, you know what, I'll leave this business, doesn't matter what the cost is, and a lot of people said, that's a ridiculous idea at the time, why would you leave LivingBrand and go do something that is way more risky, that's going to cost you way more money, and it's going to take way more time. But I went and did it anyway. So I left LivingBrand, and this is where I call a period of filtered optimism. So as opposed to that initial period of time where our optimism was sky high, I think I was much more pragmatic at this point in time in terms of what I expected out of running a new business. So at this time I got involved in the startup sort of scene here in Perth, so I started going to a lot more events, entrepreneurial events about setting up an app or developing an app or developing a product of some sort, and that's what I became very interested in. And I think from running the businesses where we were working for companies to build their brands and then sort of the rubber hit the road, so to speak. So we would build these brands for these companies, and then rubber would hit the road and they would drive off and they would do whatever they want with the vehicle we built for them. And I was getting a little bit sick and tired of seeing what they did with it, and I wanted to be on the inside of a company where I could drive and dictate a brand and watch it grow organically. So at that particular period of time, one of our original clients, which was a LED lighting design and manufacturing company, or a startup at that time, offered me to work as a consultant for them, as a designer, as a consultant, as a product development and all sorts of other stuff. So I thought that was a great way to start to get involved in working for a company from the inside. And it's something I never really considered before, so I went and did it, and it's been pretty good so far. And as part of that, I also have decided to start my particular startup. So what I've been thinking about for about a year or so was logistics in terms of food distribution, and I'd seen this kind of growing wave in terms of how we consume our food, how we source our food, how we distribute our food. So currently what I'm doing now, which is completely unrelated to design now, is I'm working on logistics and how we can improve those distribution channels between producers, farms, and restaurants and home cooks, which I know nothing about, but I was extremely passionate about it, and I had an idea on how to alleviate some of those stresses that producers and farms have. So I spoke to a couple of mentors, and they said to me that you should really just go and do it. And I went to a talk on Monday, actually, and Charlie Cunningham was speaking, who was the founder of one of the biggest real estate search engines in Australia, which he then went on to sell. And he said during his talk that he started the real estate website right when the .com crash happened. And he said he was a teacher at the time, actually, and he knew nothing about real estate, absolutely nothing. He'd never been involved in real estate ever before, but he went and did it anyway. So, and I think you'll start to see that as a common theme in terms of what I've done over the past 5 to 6 years. So I started to get more involved in this sort of startup world, and I got involved in a startup weekend last year at Space Cubed, and we developed this sort of a prototype for a real estate search engine, and that kind of, I think it really established that this is what I wanted to do, that this was my passion, to build something, a product of some sort, and something that people would use on a daily basis. So that's where I decided that I was going to get involved in the business of food. So after all of that, I have kind of 3, I guess, take-home points on reflection. And I've never really reflected on what I've done over the past sort of 5 to 6 years. Feels like a bit of a whirlwind, really, in terms of all the different things that we've tried to do. But the thing I think that drives me the most over this entire period of time was what I loved about design more than anything else was learning about different industries. So I remember we would work, it didn't matter if we were working with a mining company or we were working with a logistics company. I would be fascinated not necessarily by the design project itself. I would be fascinated by what that company did for a living and how they could employ hundreds of staff to do this small little task that is helpful to thousands and millions of people. And that idea of kind of just being interested in anything is what I carry through to whatever I do today. So it doesn't matter whether I'm having a conversation with a rocket scientist, or I'm learning about cash flow projections, or learning about how to build a house. I try to find a way to be interested in it, even if on the surface level it seems completely uninteresting. I will still try to look a little bit deeper and see what is interesting about it, that I can learn from it. And then the second thing I would say is this notion of when I was at uni, I was very obsessed with planning, this idea of planning where I would go in a career. So it was sort of, where would I be in 12 months? Where would I be in 24 months? Where would I be in 5 years? And I think that notion of really thinking about where you're going and then narrowing it down and saying that's the only path I can take over those years is something that I've changed my mentality on. I remember at uni we would say, in 5 years we would be working for such and such studio as a senior designer doing such and such. But over time I've changed that perspective to be less about these end goals that I want to meet and just think about each opportunity as it comes and whether I'm approaching it with the same mentality that I always would. So with the startup I'm starting out, it's less about, where will it be in 5 years? It's much more about, am I tackling this problem with the same mentality I always had? And I think if I had this approach earlier on in life, there would have been some opportunities that I could have taken, which I wouldn't have taken, because I was so focused on I needed to do this or meet this checkpoint by such and such time. So I think the notion of your value to the world and your approach to every problem that you face is more important than any checkpoint that you're trying to meet along the way. And then the last thing was to think big, really big. I think we're entering what I like to call a golden age of design. I haven't been around for long, but I've been reading a lot about this. And it's this idea of, I think the general public is definitely embracing design and it's valued much more, in particularly the last 5 years with the onset of all sorts of different technologies in terms of how we interact with people, how we solve transportation problems in the world. I think as designers we do have a unique way of thinking about things, and I would say designers should definitely get more involved in having a seat at the table to help solve some of these larger problems in the world. On this slide here we've got 6 designers, actually they were designers at some point in their life, and they're actually founders of some of the biggest companies and products that you use today. So for example, the top left there, that guy there was a designer and he's a programmer as well, but he was one of the founders of Pinterest. And then the one right there and second left to him is the 2 founders of Behance. So you've got Scott Belsky there and then you've got Matthias Correa there. So Matthias is a designer and he got involved with Behance, I think it was 2007 or right, somewhere around there. And I would like to finish on one quote that he made a couple of years ago about his experiences running Behance. And he says this, I'd never designed a website before. The first website was the Behance network. So what he says in this interview, and you can read this interview, it's in a book called Design Founders, which came out last year. I think it's just an online book, and it's a series of interviews with designers who became entrepreneurs, essentially. And the guy from Pinterest is in it as well. And in this interview, Matthias talks about never actually having designed a website before, apart from a few things for friends and family. And the first website he actually designed was the Behance network. And it's something that, from meeting a lot of people who are involved in these sort of large companies, and my friend of mine recently started a startup in outsourcing tasks recently, which he launched here in WA. And she had never been involved in business or that before. And on that talk I went to on Monday again, they mentioned this again, which is there is never going to be an ideal time to do most things in life. Whether you want to ask that girl out across the other side of the room, or whether you're buying your first house, or whether you're starting a business that you have no business starting. Or you know nothing about business and you want to start something. There is never going to be a perfect time to start. And I think that's the take-home point I would make, is I had no business starting a design studio when we were 22. I have no business starting a food distribution company now at 27. But I think there is never a right time to do it, and if you're truly passionate about something that you want to do, then you really should just go out and do it, I would say. That's not to say you should do anything with absolute abandon, because I don't think that's the case, because every step along the way I made in terms of starting up these businesses has always been done with immense amount of research and trying to understand whether there was a problem we can solve. But you always have naysayers, so people always tell you, you can't do this, or you're not experienced enough, or you need to work for another 5 years, or you need to work for another 10 years. That will always be the case, so you kind of have to just say, is it the right time for me to do it? And if the answer is yes, then you should just go do it, I would say. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Emily. Next speaker has worked in the design industry for many years. He has worked in several leading agencies and studios. Today he is the design director of the brand agency and also the vice chair of AGDA WA, Dan Agostino.
Thank you. I did not have my presentation keynote, so I shut up straight away. Really awkwardly, I've realised I'm actually wearing the same shirt. No. And I've got 3 things to hold, so I don't know what to do first. Okay. I'm actually really happy to be, can everyone hear me? I'm actually really happy to be standing here talking tonight. I was sort of one of the organisers of 5/15/25 last year, so there's a really big turnout, which is great to see. A lot of familiar faces. I'm really nervous, so I do apologise. I thought I'd structure my presentation in 3 halves, as I like to call it. I'm sort of going from where I've come from, where I am now, and where I'm going. So if I get lost along the way, that hopefully will sort of help guide me in there. I like to put movie references in wherever I can, just for comedic value anyway. I really need to sort of start talking about, where it all began. I know tonight is a lot of it's about the influence that we've had and the inspiration that we've had. And I don't want to get fluffy, or I don't want to get too emotional or sentimental or anything like that, but I really sort of need to look back to, sadly, it's really sad to say this, but I need to look back to my parents, and that's going to sound a little fluffy, and I do apologise as I said, but if going through this whole process of realising, okay, well, hang on, where am I today? What's actually gotten what's gotten me to where I am today? I really need to look back to those influences that I actually had as a child, and the reality is that's actually what's shaped us and shaped me and sort of created, I suppose, me. I really believe that we are completely I don't know, we're sort of shaped and we're moulded from our environment, and to me that was the 2 biggest factors in my life. This is my mum. She's going to hate me for actually putting this up, but my mum was actually probably one of the biggest influences in my life. My mum has always been an artistic soul. This is like when I was born. This is like in the early 70s. And she was the biggest driver for me, sort of having any sort of artistic value in life. I had 2 older brothers, and whilst they were always outside playing soccer, or they were riding bikes or whatever, my mum was the person who kept me inside. And she said, no, come inside, here's some paper and here's some pens, and you can go colour in the corner. So my mum, I think, always had this kind of goal for me to be in some sort of artistic space. She came here, I'm Italian, my mum came here when she was about 3 years old, and she came from Sicily, and she came, it was post-war, so I think she grew up in a time in Australia when it was a little bit, not frowned upon, but they got picked on a little bit growing up, and so therefore I think her growing up, her sort of outlet was in the creative industries. Her outlet was arts, and I think that's one of the things that she always kind of pushed on to me growing up. I remember being a kid, and she was always showing me her high school folio, her art folio, and continually just sort of reiterating how important it was to have that sort of artistic vision. And to me, that was really important. Interestingly, my mum's in her late 60s now, and she's actually still teaching arts and crafts. She lives in Queensland, and she teaches arts and crafts up and down the North Queensland coast. So she's, always, as I said, always been an artistic soul, I think. This is a photo of my dad. Now, it's a really bad photo, I do know that, but it's probably one of the best ones I could actually find of my dad. My dad's a motor mechanic, and he's probably the least artistic person you will ever meet in your life. He finds it really hard to grasp the English language, let alone anything to do with art, or anything to do with design. My dad came here from Italy when he was about probably 18 to 20 years old. And I think like a lot of other Italians at that time, they came here with one goal, and that was to work. It was pretty bad back home, so their whole drive for coming here was to basically work. And like my dad, he sent money back home. So I think from my perspective, the thing that's influenced me most about my dad is that he's instilled in me this idea of this sort of drive, no pun intended, but this sort of drive and this continual sort of motivation to keep working harder and to keep doing better. He always used to say this to me when I was younger, and this is one of the things that apparently I still do now, but if you're not going to do things properly, then don't bother doing them at all. I think from a design perspective, I actually think this is really quite relevant. I thought I'd create a little bit of a timeline of my life just to sort of help me sort of put a few things in perspective maybe as to like where I've come from, sort of showcase a bit of my journey as to where I actually got before today. I know clients love seeing timelines, so I thought this could actually might actually work quite well down the track. I could probably reuse it. And I have actually used it before, so I as I said, always liked art. Not that it was pushed on me, but it was one of the things I actually really enjoyed in high school, and probably like most design, people in the design industry now, they got into design because they loved doing art in high school, and I was no different. I went to Trinity College. One of my greatest memories about high school was being in the art room. Interestingly though, when I graduated high school, I had no interest in being a designer. I actually wanted to be a physio. And that sounds really scary because I hate people touching me or being anywhere near me, but I never ended up getting the scores to get into physio, and so what I did, I actually got into psychology at New York University, and I thought, okay, I'll do that for a year, see how it goes, and maybe I can then eventually get into physio. It never happened. I really did enjoy psychology. It was one of those things that just didn't really fit with me, and so I noticed that I started dropping out of units, all these psych units, and I started picking up all these other units that sort of, I enjoyed in high school. I didn't pick up any art units, but I just sort of, I think for me it helped me focus on what exactly I liked doing and what I didn't like doing. Psychology was definitely one of those things I didn't like doing. So I enrolled in design school at Curtin University. I've told this story a little bit over the last week, but I still remember the day, and I think most of you in obviously design circles probably remember the day that you told your parents that you wanted to become a graphic designer. Mine wasn't great. I remember my dad had this look on his face. It was completely blank, and he just looked at me and said, well, what are you going to do? How are you going to make money? How are you going to survive? I think he thought I would just be another starving artist. My mum cried, and to this day, I still don't know if she was crying because finally she was happy, and finally I would be entering sort of the artistic space, or that she had that, I had that artistic vision of what she wanted to do, or she was crying because she wouldn't have a doctor in the family because she thought a psychologist would be a doctor, and somehow she had to tell her mates that I was no longer going to be a doctor, I would be a designer. So I remember the look on their faces, and it was actually really quite hard to convince them that, no, this is what I'm passionate about, this is what I want to do. I was lucky enough to get a job whilst I was sort of finishing my second year of uni. Coincidentally, I was actually at my dad's service station. I was pumping petrol, and a guy drove in. He owned a small design studio, and he gave me a shot. And I went there on work experience. I was there for about 2-3 weeks work experience, and after a little while, he said, "Well, we're actually getting you to do real work, so we're going to have to start paying you sooner or later." And he put me on, and I was lucky enough to sort of to work throughout my final year of university. I graduated from Curtin, and I worked around town at a couple other agencies. I worked at the Shaw Group for probably about 2-3 years, which was sort of like a medium-sized ad agency at the time, which was really a really great place to work. But we eventually got bought out by a place called Marketforce, and I worked at Marketforce in their design team for about probably 7 years now. And it was a really interesting place. At the time, Marketforce was massive. They had about 150, maybe a little bit more staff. So they were quite big. And it was really an interesting time to work in an environment where there was just so many people around. That's probably about twice the size of what I think the brand agency is now. So there was people everywhere. And we got a lot of opportunities to work on really big clients, which was, from my perspective, was quite a good thing. As I said, I was there for about 7 years, and I eventually made a move to their biggest competitor, the brand agency, and I've actually been there for over 8 years now. I feel like I'm part of the furniture, and I've been there for a long time, and I kind of know everything there is to know about the place. So I'll talk about that a little bit more. Now, the reality is that I think my progression to get to where I am now is a little bit like the design process. It's not a linear process at all. It's a little bit up and down at times, and I think this is a little bit more relevant, I think, to where we are. This whole process made me realise one thing, and it made me realise that I think I actually did my first piece of design work a long time before I even set foot in design school. I actually did my first piece of design work, don't judge me for it, but I was about 12 years old. It looks a little bit like this. So there is a story, don't judge me, as I said. I was 12 years old and I was year 7 at Trinity College, and this is the brochure. It was actually a competition to design the front cover, of the magazine with the brochure to our year 7 camp to Kalgoorlie. If we were going to sell this in now, we would talk about, handcrafted, bespoke typography, and how that gives you like a bit of a personal sort of emotive feeling to it. I don't know where the blue paper stock came into it. That was just a random thing I think my mum maybe left out. But I basically entered this whole competition because I could draw, and I thought, okay, well, I'll give it a shot. The story is that there were actually 2 buses going up to Kalgoorlie. One of them was air-conditioned and one of them not. And the prize for this competition was a guaranteed seat on the air-conditioned. And I won, which I was so happy about because I really hate the heat. So I got a guaranteed seat. Now, the ridiculous thing is that the bus actually broke down about halfway up to Kalgoorlie. And so therefore, we ended up sitting on the side of the road for about 3 or 4 hours in the middle of nowhere. Blistering heat, and so the replacement bus that came and got us wasn't aircon, so I sort of really lucked out. But I've kept this. I have no idea why I've kept it, but my mum sort of keeps a lot of this stuff for me, and so this is one of the things that she gladly pulled out for me, so lucky you. As I said, I'm a firm believer that I think you're a designer a long time before you've even set foot into design school. I think it's not that it's just I don't know, it is a way of thinking, I think, and it's sort of, I think the earlier people start adopting that, especially students when you do go into design school, the earlier you start thinking as yourself as designers, then I think the better the outcome is. So that brings me to where I am today, another bad movie reference. This is us, this is the design team, and I apologise to the guys on the design team who hadn't seen this photo or didn't know that I was going to put it up, but a lot of them are actually here tonight, so thank you for spending a little bit of extra money to hear me talk some more. I talk all day long, so thank you. I've actually peppered them through the audience, so if you see someone laughing at my joke, they probably are part of my team. This is us. As I said, I've been at the brand agency for probably just over 8 years now, and for most of that time I've been heading the design team. When I first started, there was only 2 of us there, and it's actually sort of grown more and more, and we keep growing more and more. We're at 9 staff, probably 9.5 staff now, with little 80 few stuff sitting around, but we're at 9.5 staff in our design team, and it's, as I said, we're getting busier and busier, and we're getting more and more. I think a lot of the reason is because we've started to sort of embrace this whole digital world that's sort of before us. If anyone asked us, say 3, 4, 5 years ago what we did, I would always answer that we can design anything for the printed page. But I think nowadays with, as Henry said, with new technologies around, one of the things we've done is embrace that a lot more. I think people think that brand agency is the big ad agency on the hill, and to some extent we are. We do have a really large creative team, probably 10, 12 guys in it. But beyond that, we actually do offer a lot more stuff to clients than what people perceive. We have a full-time PR guy. We have a huge media team, probably 6 or 7 media staff. Probably about 25 to 30 full-time staff that are just purely digitally based. So that's not just account service staff, but it's also back-end coders and front-end coders. Half the team is actually purely digitally focused, including we've actually got one guy who is a full-time animation designer and motion graphic designer. I call him a designer of a moving image, but I don't know who paints that. But he does a lot of 3D modelling. We even every so often dabble into interior design, which I think is great because it means that we can sort of have ownership over whatever brand project we do, and we can apply it to any given touch point depending on what's relevant and what's not. We can take a brand from that early initial ideation or that conceptual stage, and we can move it through within the same team. So not just from a logo or a branding perspective, but moving it into print and press, but also into any digital world, and applying it to any interior design space or 3D space or environmental graphic space. So I'll talk through some work coming up. I'm not going to talk too much about it, but I'll just talk about some of my thought process behind some things. This is a project we did probably about 18 months ago now. I'm a really big believer that design is generative. I know that sounds a little bit fluffy, but I really think that design is something that it lives and breathes. And I'm not a big fan when people give us style guides and it always says a logo has to be this big and it needs to be 11 millimeters from the right-hand edge and it always has to appear in this shape and size. I tend to sort of throw those away quite quickly, and I like the idea of a logo evolving. I like the idea of it sort of taking its own form depending on where it's going to be applied. This was a brand idea we did a little while ago, and I thought, well, it could be interesting to keep it as just a one-off. That's nice, but I thought, well, what would happen if we just pulled it apart and there was a whole different series of brand identities? I think we ended up doing maybe 40 to 50 different executions of this. There's only a couple of them. But I really like that idea of it taking its own shape and taking its own form depending on the application it's in. As I said, we did a ton of these things. We did a whole lot more as well. And yeah, it was really about, well, okay, what else can we bring to it rather than it living in its own static look, its own sort of static feel. Some more branding stuff. I really like the idea of applying the thought of language and how language affects a brand, and regardless of what the brand is, how big or how small it is, I think language can play a really key part. I know you can't read any of that, but we really applied language. I think it was quite beautifully, and how the tone of voice and the language that we use really, I think, was quite strong in this particular example. It was a rebrand we did probably about 2 years ago now for Family Pharmacy. Some more branding stuff. We're obviously a really big fan of typography. I think most designers are. This was something that actually picked up the typography award in communication arts a couple of years ago. And obviously illustration. We do a lot of work at the brand agency for land estates, and I know people think that that's probably all we do, but I think that whenever we get a new brief, we really sort of take it, see what's the most unique thing we can bring to that brief. I think every job is an opportunity, regardless if it's in an industry that you're so used to working in, then what else can you bring to it? This was a land estate we did down in Spearwood, and so we thought, well, let's create, I suppose, like a bit of an emotional feel to it. And so what we did in every single application was sort of bring the brand to life, not just through language, but through the photography style. We did a whole lot of signage, which was using like recycled material. Everything had this sort of warmth around it. Do a lot of work for the Perth Zoo. I worked a couple of years ago with a guy by the name of Rick Cairns at Market Force, and he instilled in me this idea that brands should be layered, and when you look at them from one point of view, it's great, but then when you can read into it something else, it's even better. And the more layers you can add to a brand, then the better it is. And I think this is a really good example. The more times you look at it, you keep sort of revealing something new and something different. This is a project I worked on probably over 10 years ago now. I actually did this at Marketforce for a childcare centre, and to this day I still love it. It's a really nice. It's got a nice timeless quality to it. I love that sort of gentle peacefulness in it. Just a few more examples of some branding as well. We have a really long-standing relationship with Landcorp. I've actually worked with them for probably over 14 years now. This is my third agency that I've actually worked with Landcorp. And it's actually quite nice because they're a client that we have actually, I think, brought along on this whole design journey. They were quite new to it 14 years ago, and I think now, after all this time, we've really started to take another step up and actually do some really nice branding projects for it. A bit more stuff from Marketforce. Again, some more generative design. So I really love the idea where you can substitute logos in and out depending on the application, and actually just having a little bit of fun with it. This is some signage we did a couple of years ago for Princess Margaret Hospital. The client came to us and said they really wanted to create a timeline of their key achievements with the hospital over the last 20 or 30 years or something. And I thought to myself, that's actually really boring from a kid's perspective. Why would a kid want to read a timeline? It's signage that at the entrance of the hospital, it's probably about 50 or 60 metres long. And so we had this idea of actually creating a kid's storybook. They've got a mascot by the name of Stitches the Bear, and the whole point is that Stitches the Bear told the story of the hospital. So if anyone ever goes to Princess Margaret Hospital, they sort of walk along this whole entrance, and it actually just brings the whole idea to life, rather than just as a client wanting a timeline. We've created something really more interesting and fun. We do a lot of pro bono stuff as well. I think with pro bono you can actually have an opportunity to do some really interesting things. This is a project we did 2 years ago for Food Bank WA. They're a really good charity to get behind, and what our point was to create a leave behind booklet for them that actually sort of sold their story when they were going out looking for funding and looking for, I think, people to believe in their vision. So from the absolute get-go, we created this book that every single page was uniquely designed. But we don't really like the idea of ideas being templated or cookie cutter, so every single page had its own sort of unique feeling to it. So in order to open the book, you had to tear open this food label, and then from that point on, it was completely tangible throughout. We did some really cool typography examples, creating 3D typography, and then how that on the other side sort of translated through, and you can see like the oil stains coming through the paper. It was a really tangible booklet. A couple of days ago, we actually launched a new brand for UWA. This is something that we've been working on for probably about 18 months to 2 years now as well. So it's been, it's a really long process to take for a brand, but it's something of this size. It's actually not that uncommon. We're luckily enough, we could work with Stephen Banham from Letterbox in Melbourne, who is a fantastic typographer. So he helped us craft some bespoke typography for them, and we created a whole new brand identity that it's really tricky when you're dealing with a brand that's 30 to 40 years old, and then how do you actually bring that to life when there's so many people with invested interest in it. How do you actually do that respectfully, not throwing out its whole heritage and its whole traditions? How do you move it forward into a space for today? We came up again with this idea of it being completely generative. So we were sort of influenced by this idea that when you study, you really, surrounded by all these amazing things at the university. So we created this whole pattern library of close to 200 textures and patterns where you can substitute them in for every single faculty. So everything looks completely new and completely fresh every single time. Also doing some cool stuff for Perth International Arts Festival. We worked with them for the first time last year, but although the brochure's nice, not fantastic, but what we wanted to do was bring a like an interesting digital twist to it. So we made a whole lot of activation points in the brochure. We could actually scan with your mobile, and it actually would bring that content to life. And it would sort of play a whole lot of videos and just really sort of showcase some more rich content that they had. We looked at this, I suppose, almost from like a holistic level. So we didn't just do the printed brochure, but we also did their website, developed the app, and we sort of created that technology to do it as well. And a really cool project that we've been working on probably the last, almost 12 months now. It's an estate in the northern suburbs of Perth, sort of heading up towards the Anship Way. It's called Alara. It's the indigenous name for sunlight. It came to us it was a joint venture between a couple of our clients, and they came to us, I remember, on a Wednesday, and they wanted us to present on a Friday, three concepts fully developed, and we thought, okay, how are we actually going to get this done? And it was a competitive situation with us and another particular agency. And somehow we did, and we ended up winning the job, and I think it's amazing work, probably some of the best we've done. I need to take credit to Janice for really driving it. But the whole premise was this idea of it being a clever place to be. And so every single time we designed any piece, we really focused on this idea of cleverness. And we thought about the idea that a lot of clever people really just see the world in a different light, and it almost became a bit of a mantra for us that every time we would design something, we would then stop and redesign it and try to be a little bit more clever about it, a little bit more different about it. We did a whole lot of stuff for it. We created handcrafted typography. We actually did 3 typefaces, not 2, but and that sort of became a really strong identifier, I think, for the brand. As I said, it was our sort of little mantra with every single piece. So every single thing we wanted to do, we wanted to be different with it. This is like a little poster that came out of one of their brochures. Some brochure examples where every other estate was developing these really huge brochures. We did something completely different. We designed this really, this tiny little like a pocket guide to life. It was more of a philosophical thing, I think. But we designed every single element of it, including all the illustrations to it. And we even wrote it ourselves because we thought the copywriters probably wouldn't get that right tone of voice that we wanted. So we designed their entire sales office as well, so had a lot of fun with the interior design. And just really played with this idea of light and just really cool different things as to the way, when the light shone through, what it was made. We designed furniture, so the bottom corner, which is actually like a light box, and everything was made bespoke. And yeah, it was actually a really, really nice project to get involved in. So that brings me to the future. This is probably the hardest thing for me to talk about because, I don't know, how does anyone ever know what's going to happen in the future? For me, it was sort of a couple of things. I think this idea of continually adapting has been really interesting. If anyone asked me 4 or 5 years ago to design anything in a digital space, I'd probably say, well, yeah, you can, but it's definitely going to be anywhere near as polished as what it is now. With around, as I said, probably 30 to 40% of all of us at the agency getting involved in digital work, I think it's almost like a necessity. It's kind of like that next step as to what we do. For me personally, it's I don't know, it's kind of hard to say, but I think that idea of just continually adapting and continually evolving, I think as a designer, that's what every job is about. It's about not being that kind of templated approach. It's about looking for new ways to solve different problems. So I think that's something that I've probably taken on myself from a personal point of view. Yeah, I think that's about it.
Thanks, Dan. Our last speaker for tonight has created some of the most iconic designs in WA over the past 20 years. He's also a renowned artist, so I introduce Steve Castledine.
Is there a need to get a beer or something? Magnificent stuff, Dan and Henry. Just delightful to see what you're all up to. It's fantastic. Yeah, look, I was a bit nervous, Dan, when you showed the Perth Zoo logo. It was, you have to word with my IP lawyers who just walked in up back there. Thanks, Paul. 30 years and 30 minutes. How much time have we got? Isn't that of interest? Look, next year will probably be 35 years I've been doing this. And frankly, who in here is actually over 35 years old? Oh, come on. All right, that's good. Look, no, thanks for staying and not running away. It's really lovely to see everyone here. I know most of the crowd of the brand agency, but that's okay. How many are students and how many are not? Students? Oh, not that many. Okay, and everybody else is not. Okay, cool. How do I work this, Dan? Yes. Okay. Look, I could have a timeline like Dan did, but mine's much simpler and it's not animated or anything like that. Okay, so yeah, 1960. So it's always very easy for me to work out how old I am, which is good. High school, uni, went to Curtin, started working for Neil Turner, who God loving was here tonight with Sue. And that was a magnificent start for me because it's, well, there wasn't a lot going on in graphic design back in those days, and pretty much Neil and a few others were the only people doing it, and I was extremely fortunate to get a job with Neil, and we ended up working on some pretty amazing projects. So we plugged on. I think I worked out that if I've about 30 seconds for every slide, I might get into 30 minutes, so just keep on me. 1994, after 13 years with working with Neil and his team, on some really great projects, we kicked off Castledine with my wife Michaela, who's here tonight, but more on her later. And we've basically been doing that ever since. So we've come from a world of, oh, okay, yeah, all right, okay. No computers, no, you know, you just sent all that stuff off to pre-press people and typesetters to do all that sort of stuff in the old days. Now, there is a prize if anyone can tell me what this infographic means. I'm a big fan of infographics, as is Stuart Medley, and everyone should be. If anyone can tell me what this means, and it's deeply personal, apart from my wife, I'll buy you a drink. Linda.
As you get older, you get grayer.
Oh, you bugger! But it's gone from Pantone 174 to Pantone 877 metallic. And there's proof. Get rid of that. Okay. True story. Even my kids don't really want to hear that colour. Infographic 2. Look, I assume, does anyone speak Japanese or read Japanese in here? Isabel? No, German maybe. What does that say? Whoa! It really does! That's the first time that's been verified that is actually my name in Japanese. It's so exciting. And that's the reason I needed to know, so thank you for coming. I'll get you a drink too. Back in 1986, the legendary Ken Kato, who was not only a great self-promoter, but a great promoter of design as a discipline and a profession, put together one of his many very lovely coffee table books, and Neil and I had the opportunity to get some work in there, and you know, there's a couple of things that I did back in 1986 for the with my name in Japanese, and it's true, that's great. That's really exciting. No idea that we verified, that's great. Okay, infographic number 3. The at the same time legendary and incredibly embarrassing boxing kangaroo, which I drew a cartoon of a boxing kangaroo for the America's Cup assault by the Bond team back in, was it 83 now? I was actually on holiday, as I recall, and Neil rang me up and said, look, do you want to draw a cartoon of a kangaroo with boxing gloves? I said, oh yeah, whatever. And of course, they then went and won the bloody thing, and every idiot in the world was banging out these stupid bloody anyway. I think that's kind of roughly what we came up with, but we did do, you know, there was a we called him Ken. There was Ken Bold for different applications. And every nut in the world was banging out their own crazy flags and things until they decided that they'd rein everything in. The Australian Olympic Committee now have the licence for this. Neil and I signed our lives away and made virtually nothing out of it, which is an absolute tragedy, because if you're going to have something so embarrassing out there, you'd like to think you make some money out of it. But anyway, to this day, even, you know, Reclaim Australia are waving the kangaroo flag, which is quite disturbing. I think even Wimbledon they had it last time, but there you go. So maybe that's the design, in inverted commas, that will outlast all of us. Okay, now, apart from this bloke who's sitting in the audience, does anyone know who these other two jokers are on each side of Neil Turner? Les Mason on the left and Rick Langdon on the right. These are three characters, I suppose, who had some significant influence on me as a young designer back in the old days. Both Les and Rick were both American. And Neil was homegrown, but all three of them had very high standards and wanted to make sure that graphic design, as we enjoy it now as a profession, would actually be taken seriously and you could charge proper dollars and all that sort of stuff. So Les, Neil and Rick, very significant characters in this industry, and it's not to be forgotten because it's all part of the whole sort of culture of this town. Ancient history, the pre-digital era, all these logos, labels, etc. were all done by hand and with the aid of typesetting companies. Any idea what they were? No. And I think there are trains up north where that's still on the side of them, so there you go. That's a long time ago. More ancient history now, just harking back to Les. Remember Les? There he is. Les was a very loud man and didn't mind a drink, and I think it was this job he was referring to when he said to me, as a young, you know, keen and enthusiastic designer, Steve, the top half of that label is international, the bottom half, shit! I was slightly shattered, but I moved on, and he's no longer with us, Les, but he was still a legend. And a pretty good designer, so maybe we need a few more characters, and I don't know if anyone here is prepared to step up. I'm looking at you, Stuart Medley. I need some characters, right? So this was work done in probably mid to late 80s for Matilda Brewery Company, which went on to transform pretty much hospitality in Perth through numerous businesses such as Dome, etc. And yeah, did some pretty amazing stuff. And believe me, back in the day, this was cutting edge, okay? Taking the word for it. No computers. Okay, so after I started Castline and Castline in 1994, we were very lucky to get a lot of arts, culture type work. So we did a lot for WA Ballet, we did a lot for WA Opera, several theatre companies. Most of them have been grabbed by vulture-like advertising agencies since those days, but that's okay, man. Not yours, obviously. But it is interesting. I think a lot of the bigger companies like to do arts work because it offers such lovely opportunity from a design point of view. So this is kind of mid to late 90s. We did a lot of stuff for the WA Ballet Company, which was great fun. There we are, doing stuff, you know. There's the balcony upon which we gaze. And there's, what's that? I don't know, it's a hovering cursor. Interesting. What's going on? Really, we've had a good library. We've got a lot of books on all sorts of subjects, ranging from pretty much everything in art and design that you can think of. And we use digital, we use hand drawn, we use painted, we use all sorts of stuff. But more of that later. There's the Cimolino coffee machine, very important part of the business, and various bits and pieces. So all points of inspiration for us. There's a Batman comic, that's important. Okay, so here's some stuff, and there's a lot of it, so I'm not going to dwell particularly on any of this stuff, but we've done a lot of work over the years for corporate branding, sport branding, you name it, we've done it. One thing about Perth is if you do one thing, someone finds out about it and usually tracks you down to do something else. Perth Glory have obviously done redesigns and reinvented themselves several times since they started. That was the original logo. The WAFL needed to try something to try and compete with the whole AFL extravaganza. That's Hartley's, who are a stockbroking firm. That's Wacker, which is cricket. That is Perth Airport, and that's Anzac Day. But there's some funny stuff about Anzac Day coming up. Okay, so rebranding DWA, Dan showed. We did Edith Cowan about, I don't know, maybe 14, 15 years ago, which was a complete transformation from where they were with the good old Shield and all the rest of it, like every other uni. So I'll show you a bit more of that stuff in a minute, but kind of inspired, I suppose, by Mondrian a bit, but we were trying to give something a bit of branding potential instead of the tried and true sort of elements. G monogram for an antique shop, C graphic for Clemens handmade guitar makers, Cafe 125, try and design something for 125 that doesn't have any numbers in it, Bluebear Tools, just a tool thing, WFI, again, what's going on there? It's not part of design, just a bunch of stuff that we've done, and there really are a lot of these, so I'm not going to go through it. Okay, so Perth Airport, we did, it's not just a kind of pretty thing, the whole idea was it was based on native flora. The tendrils of this thing are all based on elements that are to do with the management of the airport, and etc, etc. I'm pretty happy that that hasn't been redesigned yet by the brand agency, but I'm sure it's coming. It's only a matter of time. So yeah, it's hard to assess, branding in sort of isolation, but this is what we had, and it was, nicely done, and there was a lovely corporate manual and, all that sort of stuff, and beautifully drawn and all that sort of stuff, but really did look a hell of a lot like everything else that was being done in the sector. So this was kind of, I suppose, an attempt to create some branding that would actually be applicable to a whole bunch of different things, and I think it's held up pretty well. It seems to work pretty well at the moment anyway. And it's in that sort of context that you need to assess these things. So I would argue that it's certainly distinctive. WFI, I don't know if the designer of that's in the room, but they weren't happy with it, so we did that. And signage and stationery and website and all that sort of stuff. And same thing, that's the environment that you're operating in, and you need to be able to have some sort of distinctive characteristic. WFI own green because they are pretty much the only insurance company that specialises in agriculture, so it was a no-brainer. Okay, there's not a cowboy hat, but dealing with cowboys, interesting little thing, this happened last week, so it's sort of timely. I was bombarded with a whole bunch of emails from people I've never heard of, and it wasn't about penis enlargement or anything like that. There are a lot of people outraged that this graphic had been appropriated or misappropriated by the National Democratic Party of Australia, who, on closer reading, look, I apologise to any extreme right-wing Nazi nutters in the room, but pretty much that's an organisation. And what had happened is on their Facebook feed there was all this stuff about, hey, you've knocked off this logo from Castledine, blah, blah, blah. And it's all this stuff about how the guy was going to lose his house and all this. It was fantastic. It was really, really lively. So this is what he'd done. He pitched that. He'd done a bit of a trace and then plonked his own Facebook details in there. And lo and behold, there it was. So I thanked all these kind correspondents and flipped an email to the RSL, who are ultimately the client for this job. And they didn't have to do anything. Social media did the job. It was a quite extraordinary phenomenon. In the space of a day, 4:30 in the afternoon, I get a call from Blair Cottrell, who's the man behind this organisation. And Blair was a slightly nervous person, I'd be fair to say. I said, who's that? I said, that's Steve. Oh, okay, mate. Mate. Look, I don't know anything about this, copyright business, but, I'm really, really sorry. And I said, well, look, it's probably best if you talk to the RSL because they'll talk you through it. So he duly did it, and he's great credit. He's got here a little retraction. It was removed duly. After a phone call to a representative from Castledine and Castledine Media, and Mr. John Arthur, manager of media and marketing at the Western Australian RSL, turns out our original choice for a party graphic was not an ethical one. We apologised to both Castledine and Castledine Media and the RSL WA and thanked them for being as delightful and understanding as they were. The party will not be using the image again. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. But it went on because on the Facebook feed there was, oh bullshit, you didn't even talk to them. It was, fantastic. I love Facebook. It's just a magnificent thing. So that was a little adventure last week. So timer. All right, here's more stuff. How many of you saw John Emery's presentation of his exquisite packaging? Come on. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm not going to try and compete with John's exquisite packaging. Here is some packaging I've done. And it's got foil and then plastic and shit. But for some strange reason, like the kind of mad sport fever thing we went through, we went through a beer fever thing as well. So, look, it's kind of... When a client comes to you and says, oh, we want to do a whole bunch of beers and, based on different cultures and all that sort of stuff, you just got to think, oh, thank you, really. So, old school design, I drew all these things up by hand in fine felt pen and coloured them in, stuff, and then sent them off to a young person to vector them for me. And that's the result, which was extremely self-indulgent and a lot of fun, so... just like that stuff. Same kind of deal. I do need to get the word bespoke in there. Bespoke typography. And, packaging. Okay. That was designed for the kind of younger female demographic, which is interesting because it's about 10% alcohol, but anyway, that's kind of interesting. So this particular company decided they wanted to have a version for the male market, so we came up with Red Devil, which would have been just great. I was so excited about pretend, Polynesian tattoos and the whole, extension of this brand, and they just couldn't use Red Devil because it had so many issues with copyright and IP and all that stuff that Blair at the National Democratic Party of nutters hadn't paid attention to. So sadly, this never happened, which, I think Dan and Henry would both agree that there are many designs that you would be very proud to have had happen that kind of end up sitting in a metaphorical drawer on your computer, never be seen again. Oh, maybe something will come up with this one day. We were very lucky enough to be approached by Scott Prick for a number of years to do, pre-GFC, in fairness, to do really lovely kind of, I suppose, examples of what printers can do. So it was really a case of do whatever you can think of and we'll just make it happen. So it was really a lovely opportunity just to do packaging that you would not normally get to do on something like a calendar, because it ended up being self-promo for the photographer, the designer and the printer. So what I did was I illustrated pencil drawings, printed on like tracing film and then die cut with the picture. It was, just lovely stuff. So and with, you know, tricky little string things that John knows all about. If you need to know how to do that, John will tell you. But lovely fun and just a really nice project to work on. We did probably 5 or 6 years of these. This was the brief was pretty much, let's do a calendar on chocolate. And we thought, okay, right, well, yes, can we do something interesting? So we sort of went down the path of the kind of Aztec thing about chocolate being the food of the gods. So there was lots of foiling, exotic metallized paper, metal print, embossing, you name it. There was just everything on this. There was matte and gloss varnishes. It was just fantastic. So all the photography was art directed by me. We found a fantastic little chocolate factory in Welshpool of all places where they had people with exotically coloured hands, which was fortuitous. And yeah, it was just a really lovely project, so kind of hard to capture in a photo. So just to show you a few, I suppose just to show you the calendar thing that's in some sort of context, it's kind of hard to look at it without actually having the item in front of you, but each year we have to come up with something. Invariably it would come at a time when I just didn't have any time to think of anything. And this was a freebie in the sense that we got calendars to hand out to clients, but we weren't being paid to design it. So I ended up in a bit of slight panic, wandering about the garden, thinking, oh God, maybe I can take some interesting abstract photos of some plants or something, which kind of worked, which was a bit of a relief. So 2006 calendar looked something like that. Now these are just close-up photos taken not by me, these are taken by a professional photographer, Richard Gave, who's not here. Richard took these shots under my direction, and unlike Dan and Henry, who are digital natives, I just kind of flicked the inversion button in Photoshop and whoa, that's good. So there's a tip for it. And you get kind of amazing type of amazing kind of landscapey kind of feeling from a close-up organic shape. So, and this is what happens. And we kind of created this kind of colour bar thing. There's probably some app to just do that automatically now, but I actually did it by hand. I'll just take samples of those colours and I'll create anyway. So yeah, they're obviously taller than what I won't show you, but kind of gives you an idea of how the whole thing panned out, which is rather lovely, and it's kind of spectacular to see it on a big screen instead of a tiny guest calendar. That was another one we did. The theme was water, obviously. Michaela, who's a superb writer, did all the text for it. You can't really read there, but trust me, it's great. And again, hadn't really any time to kind of think of anything to do for it, so we ended up doing very, very fancy Photoshop work with, you know, the flip of the image and creating impossible sort of landscapes and riverscapes. It was kind of cool, a bit Japanese and interesting. That's cool. That's cool. Cat Island. You know, and it was just really having some fun with that sort of stuff. So, you know, I'm a big fan of self-indulgence in graphic design. If you can't do that, then frankly you're missing the point. Okay, now fine art. Okay, this is something where I am inclined. If it connects with someone, it's lovely if someone buys it, but I tend to work in water-based media because oils scare the hell out of me. But it's also a response, I suppose, to, you know, the kind of lovely precision that the digital world provides. I mean, a number of times I've tried Apple Z on these and it just hasn't worked, you know. You've stuffed it, Steve, you know. So splashing water with the paper and colour and seeing what happens is kind of fun. So there's a bit of stuff about that. I don't know what's going on there, but something about plumage or something. But you know, I'm having fun, so leave me alone. John, you might like to use them on wine labels. I don't know. There's got to be a possibility. And I love drawing. I won't stop drawing. It's just something I just have to do. Painting, slightly weird painting. Okay, now really to the whole point of the speech tonight, which is really, Michaela and I work in a partnership, but it would be fair to say that, you know, as my son is setting, hers is just completely going ballistic. So I don't know if you saw the crocheted rhino at Cottesloe a couple of years ago, but that is the work of my wife. And we just found out last week, in fact, that he's arrived in California, where the retired Stanford professor who brought him in Bondi has just received the crate. So he's now getting used to the life in the Napa Valley, which is lovely. So and we've got visiting rights, so that'll be great. That's taken at Bondi actually, which is pretty cool. More of Michaela's work. I don't know if you saw the crows at Cottesloe a few years ago, but she won the sculpture prize with those pieces. This is a piece coming up at an exhibition soon. This was a piece for Bondi a couple of years ago. All crocheted. If you do know what crochet is, it's kind of like intense knitting, I suppose. And these are pieces that she's currently working on, which are absolutely astonishing, and I just hope that she sells them all and I can just retire. So thank you. That's it. I don't know how we get the time, but I would just like to thank Brendan for throwing the hat in the ring, because when I was president of AGDA some time ago, I couldn't ask myself to speak. I'd also like to thank Dan, who's just been so kind of helpful and supportive through the whole process. And he seems surprised that I'd want to get up and rap it on about my stuff. Pleasure, absolute pleasure. Really fun and kind of nice to see what you've been doing and what you've been doing, Henry, which is confusing me a bit because in 6 years you've kind of done more things than I've done in my, you know, whatever it is. But I guess I just need to keep doing this stuff. I just love it. So it's very hard for me to get my head around what you're doing. So I'll take my hat off to you. Thank you, team. Thank you.
Do you have any questions for Steve, Henry, or Dan?
Come on. Don't leave me up here by myself. Have you got some previous questions from your stuff? Where are they?
How bad?
How many of you actually had a portfolio when you went and found your first clients?
I'll leave that to Henry. Your newest.
Yes, we did have a very, very small portfolio, but I think it really only had a couple of pieces of work in it, and some of it was personal projects. So I wouldn't really call it a portfolio, more than just being a mishmash of stuff we could put together. But, yeah.
I had one, but it was bad.
I didn't have to look for any because I got a job with Neil, but under false pretences, because the folio I took in, he said, "Oh, where are those other couple of pieces I seem to recall from the graduation show?" I said, "Oh, yeah, I must have left them somewhere." I don't know if they were someone else's project, but anyway, it was enough. Probably Sue's, actually.
Actually, it'd be a good one.
Well done. Sort of piggybacking off of that, with more so for you two, when you're in hiring positions and everything, knowing what your first portfolio looks like, does that have an impact when you use somebody else's?
That's actually a really good question. Yeah, look, okay, I get a lot of folios sent to me every week. So yeah, I think, I don't really know how to actually answer that really well. I don't know, it's sort of, yeah, I have some sort of preconceived idea as to what is kind of like, yeah, that's a great folio and what's not. You can usually tell quite quickly how good the person's work is before getting too far advanced into the folio. I know that hasn't been to answer to your question, but yeah, you can have
I haven't hired a lot of people over the years, but I have hired, the people I have hired I've kind of known. I think there's no question that if you can present personally with your work, it makes a huge difference. I mean, I would judge the person on their enthusiasm and their clear passion for what they're doing. It can almost get a job on that alone. So that's something I've observed anyway, that if you really, you see a lot of students, some of them are a little bit reluctant to kind of open up because they're a bit, you know, nervous or whatever. But if you can really just show a real love of what you're doing, then it's kind of infectious. So that would be my advice.
Yeah. There's actually, sorry to continue on. Yeah, two out of my staff have actually come to us through work experience 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago, and so I think that whole idea of keeping in touch and whatnot has really worked.
Enjoy AGDA.
AGDA.
Question for Henry. It's not a question, more just a concept that I'd like you to talk to. You talk about being uncomfortable, or comfortable with being uncomfortable. Talk a little bit about the fear, the overcoming of fear and the risk factor involved in taking on adventure that is bigger than you. Like you've taken on adventures and you've taken on bigger adventures as you have progressed, and that notion of
I guess for me it's always this notion of I don't really want to live with a lot of what ifs. So the idea of having to live with what ifs kind of scares me more than actually doing it. So it's the notion of regret, I guess, that drives me to try the things I do. So in the end, I think I'd rather try and fail than to not try at all. It's cliche, but it's a cliche for a reason, I guess. So yeah.
piggybacking on what Henry's just said, would you like to talk about your ifs and what ifs and biggest challenges?
Well, yeah, look, it's interesting. When I finished school, I went and started a law degree because I thought, I'm pretty smart. I can do that stuff. Which is just dumb because, back to the passion question, really, it was a no-brainer. But I kind of do wonder a bit about had I gone down that path. What I looked at was the prospect of doing law, but kind of having the art thing on the side, sort of stuff. And I spoke to a couple of people who tried it and it didn't work, and they were regretful. So, I kind of, I don't know, I sort of characterise myself as an old school kind of artisan. I would have been happy in a guild back in the 1500s, where you just do this stuff and that's what you do, and you don't have quite the passion and zeal that Henry has of reinventing, and that's, I think that is characteristic of this era we are in, where you can't really assume that what you've trained for is what you're going to keep doing, because it just doesn't seem to work that way. I mean, Dan's kind of in that zone where, you've had a couple of long-term jobs and that's very stable and sensible. But I really do wonder. I applaud that, but I just really wonder if this can continue, like that. So the world that Henry's in, where everything's changing all the time, is incredibly exciting. But you have to have the capacity to adapt. And I've got to say, I do struggle from time to time with it. As the more we move into, I used to love setting up a spread on a brochure or something. Oh yeah, that is just perfect. Then it goes onto a website and whoa, it's all hang on. It's going to fit on a phone. And no, that's not what I just crafted all that typography for. So I forgot the question. No,
So who's the greatest inspiration?
Oh God. Yeah, Michaela, obviously. Prior to Michaela. It's another talk. I mean, I really just tried to bash this together half an hour. I think you really could wrap it on for 3 of these sessions. over that kind of period and influences and what's happened. So, I mean, I loved Alan Fletcher. He was just a genius, and but I also love typography. I want to have a crack at everything. This is where the team thing I struggle with, because I think, well, hang on, I can do that as well, And it's a problem, because you can get some really fantastic things happening that are unexpected because you're using other people's skill and talent. So anyway, enough of that.
Yes.
So we talked a lot about the golden age of graphic design that Steve's students taught, and someone had said that to you about that time when you were at Innes. And then Henry goes, this is the golden age of graphic design. Is the golden age of graphic design the one that you when you were young and inspired?
Who's that a question for?
For all of you. When is your golden age of graphic design?
My golden age? Okay, good question. It's actually funny because I think as a designer you continually look back and you're so critical. Sorry, I don't know what's happening with this, but you're so critical of what you've done. And I'm kind of standing here looking at some of the stuff that I've done a while ago, and you want to just sort of change it, or you want to continually fix it. And that's just not in design. I think that's sort of to Henry's point. You want to go out and fix everything. Golden age? I don't know. I think it's always a golden age. And I know that sounds really blasé, but I think the stuff we're doing now is probably the best stuff in design we've ever done. But if you asked me 5 years ago, I probably would have said the same thing. I think it goes back to my point about being able to continually adapt and change. Because there's so many new things out there, so why would you not want to just have a go and continually play with those to make whatever you're doing better? That's kind of how I see it. I think it's an evolving thing.
So the golden age of graphic design is continuous.
It's continuous.
I look at it from the perspective of people outside of design, starting to embrace not just design but creativity in general a lot more. I think Ken Robinson, who I do a lot of reading on, who is a kind of an ambassador on revolutionising education, he talks a lot about kind of reinventing the way we teach our kids and kind of instilling this sense of creativity in them, not just in schooling but in organisations and companies in general. So rather than kind of having a design department in a large corporation, you might embed design and creative thinking amongst the entire organisation from the inside out. I think that's why I think it's an exciting time for design.
On the other side of the coin too, there's the whole, Henry mentioned the height of the GFC. Now, back in, when was it, late 80s, was it, when the interest rates were about 18% or something? So the world you're in is the world you're in, and you've just got to kind of work with the challenges that it presents. So, I think with the benefit of hindsight, it all changes. I think that era we were in the late 80s was much more entrepreneurial. I mean, we had the crazy, Bond and Holmes of Court and those, really quite eccentric billionaire types who were doing a lot of stuff, and we were lucky enough to get involved. But I mean, they're still there. There are still those people. So, it's just, if you're paying a mortgage of 18% now, you'd be, feeling nervous.
Anything else?
Question for Steve, actually. How have clients changed since you started working?
How have clients changed? Look, I think the good ones are always good. And they're the ones that you have a rapport with, and like Henry was saying, with selling stuff, you hope that the work sells itself. Doesn't always, because some people aren't receptive. I would have hoped that more people understood the value of what we offer. That is still disappointing. It's an ongoing education process and battle, and AGDA's kind of flying the flag as an entity to do that. But I think, I've got a good client at the moment that's also a bad client, in that they're lovely and the stuff I'm doing is fine, but they're very big on having their own very odd input that doesn't enhance the product or the communication or whatever we're trying to do. So, you know, it's kind of a double-edged sword to a degree. I think the best clients are the ones who keep coming back to you. You know, and I was going to rant about this earlier, but I decided not to. But I will now. No, there was a thing about, and with great respect to these guys who I think do beautiful work. There is a strange thing going on at the moment in our culture where everything has to be refreshed and reinvented and changed, and you know, I suppose you look at something like the Collingwood Football Club, not a great example, but you know, their identity is the same as it's been for the last 120 years or whatever. There hasn't been this, like Perth Glory, for example, had about 3 or 4 logos since I did that one. And you just think, well, hang on, you know, maybe it wasn't going as well as you thought it would, but do you really need to reinvent stuff all the time? And I think there's an element of just a lack of respect for that, or a lack of investment on behalf of the client for what you're doing. So, you know, everything we try to do, I think I can speak for all three of us, is you try to do something that's going to have, you know, long-standing positive effect for your client. But if it's not given the opportunity, then it's wasted, you know what I mean? Like, it's a wasted investment. So, not sure if that answers your question, but yeah, look, I mean, I think there are a lot of people who don't value what we do as much as they should, I guess.
Sean. Well, you've got the mic. So you've had your own studio since mid to late 90s?
Yeah.
How have you kept like your interest and enthusiasm throughout? Because it's mainly been you, hasn't it? The studio.
Paying the mortgage is a pretty good thing. I can't actually do anything else.
You could probably get a job somewhere doing, you know, paying the mortgage, but how do you kind of keep going year after year, I guess?
Look, I've got a good network of people who I bounce stuff off. You know, I mean, Paul's standing next to you. Well, you know, if we're stuck, we'll flick emails back and forth and, you know, hang on, am I wrong here? You know, is the client stupid or am I, you know? So, Paul and others. So I've got a network of people who, and I mean, that's the beauty of this age that we're in. You can use specialist disciplines from all over the place, and I think it's just brilliant. And you don't need to leave your house to do it, so you don't need to clog up the traffic or, you know, anything else. So we've got our own studio, but it's kind of purpose-built for what we do, as you know. Yeah, well, the passion thing, I guess I only feel like I'm about 32, so it was a bit of a surprise to me to find out I'm turning 55 this year. That's actually a little bit shocking. It's like the hair colour thing, I hadn't noticed that. At least I've still got some. But anyway, that's not unusual. But you know, there is something about, if you really do love this stuff, you can't lose interest in it. I am mindful of the waves of fashion that come and go through this industry, you know, whether it's typographic or, you know, whatever. And I try to not avoid falling into it, but avoid kind of being dragged along a particular direction. I'd like to think there's a unique solution for every problem and that, you know, I can provide it and that my work doesn't all look the same. Maybe it does, I don't know, but I'd like to think that I can come up with something a bit different. So yeah, look, I don't know. I mean, it's a real tragedy actually that some of the really good designers of Perth, you know, drive courier vans, which, you know, because they can't make a quid, which I think is a bit sad, but, you know, that's the reality. You've got to roll with the flow.
Henry and Dan, you both came from different areas other than design, creative design. What advice do you have for someone who's going through this from a different industry to what is different type of study? Sorry.
Everyone's throwing all these hard cards.
Yeah, I'm not sure really, to be honest. I think when I left my kind of writing degree that I did for about 12 months, it was just more an acceptance that I'm starting again and I know absolutely nothing. And I think what I touched on earlier on was I was fortunate enough to surround myself with super passionate designers. Like Dan used to say to me, you know, he had wanted to be a designer since he was in high school, early high school. So I think if I hadn't met people who were equally as passionate to kind of help each other improve, then I wouldn't be here today. So I think if I had kind of just been on my own, it wouldn't have been the same. So I definitely think a good piece of advice is to surround yourself with just people who want to do well.
Yeah, I think it's, I don't know, I think deep down you actually know. In my my personal experience, I knew straight away that I was going down that wrong avenue, although, through high school it's drilled into you to go down certain avenues. Design was definitely not on my radar in any way, or anyone that I actually knew. So yeah, I think it's always just having the strength to actually make a decision to, I suppose, respect what you truly believe in. Looking back, I've always loved design. I've always I can't ever think of myself as doing anything else. I know. So hopefully that helps. But I think it's sort of like input in all of us.
Actually, that's
not clients.
What was I going to say? There's a company called ALT in New Zealand, the Alt Group. Have a look at their website because there's nothing on it. It's just got their phone number or something, and they're very cool. They're not really graphic designers. How they've come from a fine art background, which is related, maybe not what you're talking about exactly, but they've come from fine art. They've created this organisation, and at the last AGDA Awards I went to, which is about 4 or 5 years ago, they won everything. And they're, in Auckland or something, which has got a population like Bunbury. And I just kind of wonder, where have they got the capacity to do beautiful arresting typography? Where's that come from? But it must be about just surrounding yourself with like-minded people who are just into it, because it's a really interesting case in point. If you ever get a chance to see anyone from Alt presenting, Dean Poole we should get here. He is brilliant and funny and just, anyway, exactly.
I'd like to thank Henry, Dan and Stephen again for coming out tonight and sharing their stories. So, thank you.